The camera opens on darkness, and then a faint, flickering light reveals a small, pale boy lying motionless on an iron examination table. His chest does not rise, his lips are blue, and yet, from the silence, a single, tremulous voice pierces the air. "He's here, don't let him in." This is Daniel Frost, the child who spoke when he wasn't breathing. The records, fragmentary and smudged by time, claim he was found in the infirmary of the Frost Seminary in St. Harrow, Massachusetts, 1847. The seminary itself had no prior mention in local histories, as if it existed solely to conceal a truth too dreadful for the town to remember. Witnesses, teachers, priests, and distant relatives would later report that Daniel's voice did not belong to him alone. It echoed the words of the missing, the silenced, and sometimes the guilty. Those who heard him describe the sensation of being watched from within their own minds, as if his presence unearthed the memories they had buried deepest. In the weeks that followed, the town endured a cascade of disappearances, unexplained fires, and whispers that the boy's eyes held a knowledge that no living being should possess. Parents abandoned their homes, children were taken by the church for their protection, and the seminary itself became a decaying monument to hidden corruption, a place where faith and fear were indistinguishable, and where silence was enforced with unyielding rigor. Tonight, we will unravel the impossible story of a child who spoke beyond the threshold of life and death. We will examine diaries scorched with fear, letters stained with tears, and the accounts of witnesses whose memories are as fragile and unreliable as the flickering images that survive from that autumn. Some histories are erased for a reason. Some voices are silenced before they can speak. Daniel Frost's voice, however, refused to remain buried. And it still echoes if you listen closely enough. The Frost Seminary stood on a hill that overlooked St. Harrow like a silent sentinel. Its walls, blackened with soot from decades of forgotten hearths, were lined with narrow windows, their panes clouded with grime. Inside, corridors twisted like the intestines of some ancient, hidden beast. The floorboards groaned underfoot, echoing with the footfalls of students who had vanished without record, their names scratched into the walls in faint, desperate letters. Daniel was placed in a small dormitory at the end of one such corridor, a room that smelled of damp straw and disinfectant. The rector, Elias Merton, a gaunt man with eyes like chipped stone, insisted that Daniel was fragile, delicate in both body and spirit, but those who observed the boy quickly realized his fragility was an illusion. There was an intelligence in his stare that unnerved even the most composed teachers, a knowing that hinted at horrors beyond the seminary walls. It began subtly. During prayer, Daniel would whisper to unseen figures, naming sins that had never been confessed, recounting details from the lives of townspeople he had never met. Doors would slam without wind, and cold drafts would snake through the hallways, carrying faint laughter or the echo of a child's cry. Staff and students began avoiding his room, speaking in hurried tones about a presence that watches, though no one could describe what exactly they meant. One night, a teacher reported seeing Daniel lying on the floor, his chest still, yet muttering in the voice of a local widow who had gone missing the week before. Her own words, pleas, confessions, accusations flowed from him with unnatural clarity. Panic spread through the seminary like a contagion. Scholars today call such phenomena impossible, but witnesses at the time whispered that Daniel was not merely alive or dead. He existed in a liminal space where neither could contain him. The walls of the seminary, once protective, now seemed to conspire, and Daniel Frost, small and silent in appearance, became the key to a darkness the town of St. Harrow was only beginning to understand. By the end of October 1847, the quiet town of St. Harrow was unraveling. Windows were shuttered, and doors bolted against a fear that seemed to come from inside the walls rather than from the wind outside. The townspeople spoke in hushed tones of children who wandered off at dusk and never returned, of neighbors who disappeared between their own rooms and kitchens, leaving behind only chairs upturned or meals left uneaten. Daniel Frost became the focal point of these disappearances, though no one could explain why. Witnesses swore that his eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected not just the world but their own secrets, their sins and shame. Some who dared approach him reported hearing whispers, not in Daniel's voice, but in their own, their thoughts twisted into speech, spilling from the boy's lips as if he were both conduit and judge. The church in St. Harrow, once a refuge, became complicit. Father Abraham Hensley, a man of imposing stature and rumored connections to secret sects within the clergy, instructed families to bring their children to the seminary for safekeeping, promising protection from a malevolence he refused to name. In truth, those who entered often did not leave. Letters from anxious parents arrived in the weeks that followed, pleading for answers. They were returned unopened, with only the rector's wax seal as a reply. Strangely, the seminary's records from this period were sparse, partially destroyed, or intentionally misfiled. Local historians later speculated that a fire, officially reported as accidental, consumed most of the original ledger books. But survivors whispered differently. The fire had been a ritual of expulsion, a desperate attempt to bury the truth. And yet Daniel persisted. The boy who should have been silenced by death continued speaking, now in voices no one recognized, uttering warnings and pleas that blurred the line between prophecy and accusation. St. Harrow was no longer a town. It was a crucible, and Daniel Frost the spark that lit its slow, inexorable descent into fear. By late November, the seminary staff had grown desperate. Daniel Frost, now both revered and feared, had become a mirror reflecting their guilt, their unspoken sins, and the town's hidden corruption. His whispers, sometimes audible, sometimes vibrating the very air, spoke of things that had yet to happen: fires, disappearances, sudden deaths. No logical explanation sufficed. Fear demanded action. Rector Elias Merton, cloaked in authority and sanctimony, convened secret meetings in the infirmary's back chamber. Candles flickered along walls lined with jars of herbs, powders, and objects whose purposes were never recorded. The seminary's senior staff spoke in low tones of controlling Daniel, of bending his unnatural gifts to protect the town. But even among themselves, they feared him. The boy's gaze, still and unblinking, seemed to see through the layers of their deception, peeling away their moral defenses with the precision of a scalpel. It began with minor rituals, small circles, whispered incantations from old European texts long banned by the church, hand gestures that were half blessing, half suppression. Each attempt elicited a response from Daniel that chilled the marrow. He would speak in tongues that no scholar could identify, his voice layering over itself, overlapping accents, dialects, and names. Some nights, he cried out in the voices of children who had vanished from town weeks before, recounting in agonizing detail the moments of their deaths. The staff's fear evolved into obsession. They documented every word he spoke, cataloging the impossible. Some entries suggest that Daniel understood the rituals, even anticipating them, laughing quietly when the clergy faltered. By mid-December, the infirmary had transformed into a place of dread. The air itself seemed saturated with the boy's presence. His unbreathing form became the epicenter of a psychic pressure that seeped into the walls, the floors, and the minds of all who entered. What the seminary sought to control was not simply a child. They were confronting a living embodiment of their own buried sins, and Daniel Frost, whether by accident or intent, was already winning. By the winter of 1847, Daniel Frost's presence had begun to reach beyond the walls of the seminary. Parents reported hearing his voice through cracked doors, empty hallways, and even in their dreams. Children, once boisterous and playful, grew silent, staring as if listening to something invisible. Adults felt their thoughts intruded upon, their private guilt spoken aloud in tones they did not recognize. The boy, though confined to the seminary, had somehow become an inescapable conduit of fear. A farmer named Thomas Greaves swore that late one night he heard Daniel call his name from the edge of the forest. When he investigated, the snow-covered path was empty, save for footprints that began at the edge of the tree line and ended abruptly in the frozen soil, as though someone or something had vanished. Mid-step, Greaves' wife later reported that the boy's voice recited their secrets to her in the dead of night, naming sins she had never confessed even to herself. The church, attempting to assert moral authority, doubled down on its attempts to contain Daniel. Sermons grew harsher, warnings more threatening. Father Hensley instructed townspeople to avoid the seminary, claiming divine protection could be broken if Daniel's unholy abilities were provoked. Yet the more they tried to suppress him, the stronger the boy's presence became. It was as though fear itself nourished him. Some townsfolk began leaving cryptic messages, notes pressed under doors or tied to trees. "Do not listen. He hears everything." Others abandoned their homes entirely, their belongings left to rot in the snow, as though a primal dread had struck at their very souls. By now, Daniel was no longer merely a child who spoke when he wasn't breathing. He had become a living omen, a reflection of the town's unacknowledged corruption. And every whispered confession, every unspoken fear he repeated aloud, pulled the residents closer to the edge of madness. St. Harrow was dying not from fire or disease, but from the weight of truths it had long refused to face. By January 1848, fear had curdled into desperation. The seminary staff, now divided between dread and obsession, resolved to confront Daniel Frost directly. Rector Elias Merton, his hands trembling but his voice cold and commanding, called for the boy to be brought to the infirmary's central chamber. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering like nervous eyes, casting elongated shadows that seemed to writhe on their own. Daniel lay on a cot, motionless as always. His pale skin glimmered in the candlelight, his chest flat, breath absent, but the voice that emerged was alive, resonant, and horrifying. As Merton approached, Daniel spoke not in his own timbre, but in the voice of Father Hensley, then the missing children, then townspeople long thought safe behind locked doors. Each word carried their memories, their guilt, their fear. The chamber seemed to pulse with a presence no human could contain. The staff attempted the rituals once more, incantations, gestures, and the placement of talismans collected from the oldest European texts they could find. But Daniel anticipated each move. He repeated their incantations before they finished them, twisting the words into pleas, curses, and confessions that left the clergy paralyzed. One by one, the staff dropped to their knees, clutching their heads, their cries lost in the boys' chorus of voices. Outside, the wind howled through the seminary like a living thing, rattling the windows. Some witnesses later claimed that the snow around the building melted into blackened slush where Daniel's shadow fell, leaving bare patches that seemed to pulse with life. By the end of the night, the confrontation had left the seminary in chaos. Staff were broken, some fleeing into the forest in terror, never to return. Daniel Frost remained unmoving, silent, yet the voices continued echoing through the walls, through the corridors, through the minds of all who dared enter. The child who should have been confined to death had become something far greater, a vessel for the town's hidden corruption, a mirror reflecting all that had been denied, ignored, or buried. After the disastrous confrontation, Rector Elias Merton realized that conventional methods could no longer contain Daniel Frost. What had begun as desperate rituals now turned into obsessive, unholy ceremonies conducted in secrecy deep within the bowels of the Frost Seminary. The infirmary, once a place of care, became a chamber of whispered incantations, jars of strange substances, and relics stolen from graves and forgotten cemeteries. The clergy sought to bind Daniel, to tether the boy's uncanny voice to the physical world, but he resisted. Each ritual seemed to empower him further. Witnesses wrote in trembling hand that Daniel's eyes would glow faintly in the candlelight, reflecting not only his own pale visage, but the faces of those long dead, or perhaps never alive. His voice now carried more than memory. It projected visions. Clergy and students alike reported seeing shadows of themselves committing acts they had only dared to imagine, hearing confessions of sins they had never admitted even in private. Fear consumed the seminary. The boy would remain motionless, his chest flat, his lips pale, and yet he spoke. In one documented instance, Daniel recited the names of every person who would vanish in scent. Harrow in the following weeks, their deaths and disappearances described in excruciating, unbearable detail. Staff began leaving the seminary in secret, their nerves shredded, whispering warnings to anyone who would listen. Do not enter. He is not just a child. He is the echo of everything we've hidden. Outside the seminary, the town spiraled. Children refused to play. Shops closed early, doors barred. The snow carried whispers that no one could trace, warnings that twisted into fear and paranoia. Families were torn apart. Neighbors distrusted neighbors and sent. Harrow became a labyrinth of dread, and all the while, Daniel remained still silent in body, speaking in voices that belonged to the living, the missing, and the dead. He was no longer simply a child. He was a living reflection of the town's buried sins, a reminder that some secrets refuse to die. By February 1848, St. Harrow was no longer a town of quiet streets and modest homes. It had become a place where shadows lingered too long, and the wind carried warnings no one could interpret. Mysterious deaths began to plague the community, each one connected directly or indirectly to the Frost Seminary. Parents vanished without trace, children disappeared from locked rooms, and townsfolk were found lifeless in their beds, eyes wide with terror, mouths frozen mid-cry. Daniel Frost was at the center of it all, though no one could say how. Witnesses reported hearing his voice before each disappearance, repeating the victim's own private thoughts, their fears, and their unspoken sins. He spoke my guilt before I could, one survivor wrote, and the next night my husband was gone. Those who survived swore that Daniel did not merely speak when he was not breathing. He predicted death with a precision that seemed impossible, and in some instances he seemed to command it. The seminary, already fractured by paranoia and fear, tried to rationalize the events. Rituals intensified. Clergy, desperate to regain control, performed midnight ceremonies calling on powers both sacred and forbidden. Some rituals appeared to work briefly. Daniel's voice would quiet, shadows would recede, but inevitably the boy's presence returned stronger, more insistent. His murmurs now echoed through the town itself, seeping through walls, chimneys, and floors, reaching ears that had never seen him, and hearts that had never known fear. In the streets, families barricaded themselves, whispering prayers while Daniel's voice whispered back their own failures. By all accounts, he was still a child, small, pale, motionless, but his power was limitless. The townspeople began to understand that he was not bound by life or death, by walls or doors. Daniel Frost had become a living curse, the mirror of St. Harrow's hidden corruption, and the harbinger of a terror that would not end until the town itself was consumed. By early spring of 1848, St. Harrow had transformed into a town gripped by collective hysteria. Windows remained shuttered, chimneys smoked only at the will of those too terrified to leave home, and every footstep on the frozen streets was met with suspicion. Rumors ran rampant. Some claimed Daniel Frost could read minds. Others insisted he could step through walls or appear in dreams as an exact replica of anyone he chose. Fear had become contagious, infecting every household, every church pew, every classroom of the Frost Seminary. Families, desperate to protect their children, brought them to the seminary under the guise of safety. Those children rarely returned. Witnesses reported faint echoes of their voices speaking through Daniel, as if the boy were a vessel collecting souls. Parents screamed and clawed at doors, but no barrier could protect them from the reach of a child who should have been dead, yet spoke with the authority of the living, the missing, and the damned. Even clergy who once commanded respect fell to paranoia. Father Hensley's sermons grew frantic, filled with warnings and veiled threats. His own voice, however, began to falter, and parishioners whispered that Daniel had begun mimicking him, repeating his sermons word for word in the dark hours of the night, while Merton and other staff documented the phenomenon with obsessive precision. By March, the town had fragmented. Streets emptied, neighbors distrusted neighbors, and no one dared speak above a whisper for fear their words would return to them through the boy. Every private thought, every unspoken sin, became a weapon wielded by Daniel, whose still, pale form remained innocuous in appearance but monstrous in effect. St. Harrow's reality had begun to unravel. Daniel Frost was no longer simply a child who spoke when he wasn't breathing. He was the embodiment of the town's suppressed guilt, a living reflection of its hidden corruption, and a reminder that some horrors cannot be silenced, no matter how deeply they are buried. By April 1848, the Frost Seminary teetered on the edge of ruin. The clergy, exhausted and broken, resolved to attempt a final, extreme ritual to contain Daniel Frost. The infirmary's back chamber had become a place of dread, its walls lined with jars of herbs, fragments of bones, and symbols drawn in charcoal and blood. Candlelight flickered across the stone floor, casting shadows that twisted like living things. Rector Elias Merton, his hands trembling but his voice commanding, addressed the assembled staff. "Tonight," he whispered, "we bind the boy, we seal him, we must act or all of St. Harrow will perish under his influence." No one questioned him openly, though eyes darted nervously at one another. The fear of Daniel, combined with the weight of their own unspoken sins, made defiance impossible. Daniel lay on the table as always, motionless, pale, his chest flat, but the air around him vibrated with a low hum, a resonance that seemed to echo through the bones of all present. The ritual began with chants in Latin, interspersed with gestures meant to summon protective spirits. As the words progressed, Daniel's lips moved, not in sync with his body, but in the voices of those long missing. The sound was unbearable. Children screaming, townsfolk weeping, the rector himself begging for mercy. Then, inexplicably, the candles extinguished. Shadows surged across the chamber, swallowing staff and walls alike. Witnesses later claimed that Daniel's voice multiplied, layering hundreds of voices at once, repeating secrets, sins, and confessions from everyone in the room and the town beyond. Some fell to their knees, screaming, others fled blindly into the night. By morning, the chamber was silent. The seminary appeared untouched, yet the air carried a palpable weight of fear. Staff and students were gone, some presumed dead, others vanished without trace. Daniel Frost remained, motionless and unbreathing, yet infinitely alive in the voices that would haunt St. Harrow forever. The town had been irrevocably changed. Some horrors cannot be contained, and some children are never meant to be controlled. When dawn broke over St. Harrow, the town was hollowed out, both physically and spiritually. Smoke from long, forgotten chimneys mingled with the fog that crept from the hills, and the streets were eerily empty. Families who had once crowded the roads now whispered behind locked doors, their eyes darting nervously, haunted by sounds only they could hear. The Frost Seminary remained standing, but it was no longer a place of learning. It was a monument to vanished lives and a warning no one dared interpret. Daniel Frost was still there. He lay pale and unmoving in the infirmary, as if nothing had occurred. Yet the voices emanating from him had multiplied, seeping into the town like a poison. Residents later described hearing confessions of sins that had never been spoken, secrets only they knew whispered aloud in voices they recognized. Some claimed that Daniel's voice could mimic their own perfectly, delivering words they themselves would never admit. Others swore he could summon memories as real as the present, forcing townspeople to relive forgotten traumas in agonizing detail. The seminary staff were gone, vanished entirely, leaving behind only scattered journals, scorched pages, and faint traces of ritual symbols on the stone floor. No official investigation ever explained the disappearances. Locals began calling the seminary the Hollow Place, and rumors spread that Daniel had become a vessel, an eternal witness to the town's buried guilt. Even the church, once a source of authority and control, could no longer quell the fear. Clergy whispered that Daniel was a living judgment, a reflection of the sins they had ignored or committed. People no longer ventured near the seminary, and those who lived closest began leaving, abandoning homes and livestock, leaving the town to decay under the oppressive weight of silence and shadow. St. Harrow was no longer merely haunted. It had become a psychological landscape, warped and dominated by a child who should have been dead but spoke nonetheless. Daniel Frost was not simply present. He was the town's conscience, its terror, and its undoing. By mid-1848, Daniel Frost had become more than a child. He had become a story whispered in fear, a presence felt in every creaking floorboard and every shadowed corner of St. Harrow. Families who remained spoke of glimpses, a pale face at a window, a child's voice calling their name from empty streets, a cold draft carrying secrets that were never theirs to reveal. The town had become a labyrinth of dread, and Daniel was the axis around which its terror revolved. The seminary, now abandoned by staff and mostly avoided by locals, concealed its darkest secrets within walls blackened by soot and ritual. Scorched journals, fragmented manuscripts, and symbols etched into floorboards hinted at experiments and ceremonies that no living authority would claim. Some entries suggested that Daniel's unnatural abilities had been anticipated, even cultivated, by Elias Merton and Father Hensley, who had been obsessed with unlocking hidden dimensions of human soul. Whether by design or accident, they had unleashed something far beyond their comprehension. Daniel's influence seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. Witnesses spoke of hearing multiple voices speaking through him, voices of the missing, the guilty, and even those who had died long before his birth. He was no longer simply a child speaking when he should not breathe. He had become a vessel of collective memory, judgment, and fear. Every unspoken truth, every buried sin, seemed to gravitate toward him, saturating his presence with the weight of unacknowledged horrors. By this point, the boundaries between reality and nightmare had blurred. Townsfolk no longer distinguished between a voice in the wind and Daniel's presence. Every shadow became suspect, every echo a confession. The legend of the boy who should not speak, had begun to consume scent. Harrow itself, turning a once quiet town into a domain haunted not by ghosts, but by the unbearable truths its people had refused to face. Daniel Frost had transcended childhood, transcended mortality. He was now the embodiment of St. Harrow's hidden corruption, and he would not be forgotten. By late 1848, St. Harrow had become a town teetering on the edge of madness. Houses once filled with warmth now stood cold and silent. People spoke in whispers or not at all, afraid their words would return to them through Daniel Frost. Children, once playful and innocent, cowered indoors, listening to voices no one else could hear. Every street corner, every alleyway became a potential point of judgment, a place where secrets would be extracted without mercy. Daniel's presence, though physically still, had begun to dominate the very fabric of the town, windows fogged with breath not belonging to any living resident. Footsteps echoed in empty hallways, doors slammed in unison across the town at odd hours. Those who remained swore they could hear their own sins whispered back at them through the boy, often in voices they could not identify. Fear had become a sentient force, saturating walls, floors, and minds alike. Families fragmented under the weight of suspicion. Parents distrusted children, siblings avoided one another, neighbors could no longer converse without unease. Some wrote frantic letters to relatives in distant towns, warning of an unnameable presence, only for those letters to arrive shredded or smeared with water, as if the paper itself rejected the message. Even the church had lost authority. Father Hensley and surviving clergy were rumored to wander the woods at night, whispering prayers to Daniel or to powers unseen, trying desperately to appease what they once sought to control. But Daniel did not require appeasement. His voice continued to pierce the town's veil of normalcy, exposing guilt, secrets, and desires long buried. St. Harrow was no longer governed by law, faith, or reason. It existed entirely under Daniel Frost's invisible sway, a town where silence, shadows, and the echo of unspoken truths had become the only reality. By the spring of 1849, the terror of St. Harrow had reached a fever pitch. Daniel Frost, still unmoving and pale in the abandoned seminary, had become the epicenter of inexplicable phenomena. Windows rattled without wind. Shadows moved against the natural flow of light. People reported hearing faint footsteps echoing their own, even when alone, accompanied by whispers of their deepest fears and unspoken sins. The townspeople had begun to live in a state of constant vigilance, never daring to close their eyes fully at night. Children would wake screaming, claiming they had seen Daniel standing at the foot of their beds, his voice repeating the thoughts they had tried to forget. Adults began writing frantic diaries to document what they heard, yet they often found the pages blank the next morning, as though the boy, or whatever he had become, had devoured their records. Even the natural world seemed to bend around him. Animals avoided St. Harrow entirely. Livestock went missing, sometimes leaving behind strange, twisted tracks in the snow. Crops failed, not from frost or drought, but as if the land itself recoiled from the boy's presence. And more strange connected to ZCA, their own voices calling them back from miles away, repeating words they had only whispered in private. Within the seminary, the walls bore marks that no human hand could have carved, symbols etched deep into the stone, some resembling letters, others unrecognizable sigils. Candles that had been lit for protection burned with black smoke, extinguishing themselves mysteriously. No ritual, no incantation seemed capable of controlling Daniel. By this time, the townspeople understood a grim truth. Daniel Frost was no longer a child, nor a vessel merely of voices. He had become a force a living, breathing mirror of St. Harrow's hidden corruption, its sins, and its guilt. The town had been transformed into his domain, and no one, not even the clergy, could claim dominion over it. By mid-1849, St. Harrow was no longer recognizable as a town. It had become a landscape of dread, haunted by the presence of Daniel Frost. Entire families vanished, sometimes leaving behind only scattered belongings, sometimes leaving nothing at all. Children disappeared from locked rooms. Adults were found dead in their beds, eyes wide in terror, lips frozen in silent screams. Every incident bore the mark of Daniel's inexplicable influence, though no one could explain how a child, unmoving, unbreathing, could wield such power. Witnesses reported that Daniel's voice preceded each disappearance. He spoke in the exact tones of those he targeted, repeating their unspoken thoughts and hidden sins. Residents described the experience as hearing themselves betray themselves, their fears made audible, as if the boy's presence amplified the town's collective guilt. People would freeze, paralyzed by the eerie accuracy of his words, and then vanish, sometimes in the night, sometimes in broad daylight, without a trace. Even those who attempted to leave town were not safe. Travelers reported hearing their own voices echoing from the forests, calling them back, forcing them to return to St. Harrow, where disappearance seemed inevitable. Those who resisted were rumored to be found days later, wandering aimlessly along the frozen roads, their minds fractured, their memory incomplete. The seminary, already abandoned by most staff, had become a place of legend and fear. Locals whispered that Daniel had been deliberately created or altered by the clergy, trained through rituals to absorb the town's guilt and sins. Whether this was true or conjecture mattered little. The results were real and unstoppable. St. Harrow was dying, not from disease or fire, but from an invisible force that devoured its people from within. Daniel Frost, a child who should have been silent in death, had become an unstoppable reflection of human corruption, a living harbinger of inevitable doom. By late 1849, the Frost Seminary had become a ghostly relic, avoided by the remaining townsfolk who whispered of shadows and voices that defied explanation. The walls, blackened and cracked, concealed the final secrets of Rector Elias Merton and Father Hensley rituals and experiments designed not merely to educate or protect, but to create a vessel capable of holding and amplifying the sins of an entire town. Daniel Frost was the culmination of their work, whether by design or accident. Scattered journals, recovered decades later, hint at the chilling intent behind his existence. Merton's hand trembles across pages of arcane notes, the manipulation of breath, silence, and memory to craft a child who could exist between life and death, whose voice could reflect not only what was said, but what was hidden. Hensley's annotations suggest that Daniel was trained in the repetition of thought itself, able to echo the unspoken guilt of anyone who approached him. These were not merely records, they were confessions of men who had trespassed against God, nature, and morality itself. Visitors, those brave or foolish enough to enter the abandoned seminary, report that the air carries the echo of countless voices. Footsteps, laughter, crying, fragments of lives consumed by Daniel's presence resonate in every corridor. Symbols etched into floors and walls seem to pulse faintly, responding to the movement of those who dare enter. The boy, though physically still, radiates an energy that bends perception, warps reality, and amplifies fear. St. Harrow itself had been a crucible for these horrors, a town whose buried corruption and unspoken sins had been drawn into a single point, Daniel Frost. He was not merely a child or a ghost. He was the living repository of human guilt and fear, a mirror of the darkness that had long been ignored. And as the town fell further into silence, one truth became undeniable. Some creations are beyond control, some sins beyond forgiveness, and some children never meant to be contained. By 1850, St. Harrow had nearly ceased to function as a living town. Only a handful of residents remained, their minds frayed, their bodies gaunt, and their voices scarcely audible. Daniel Frost, still unmoving and pale in the abandoned seminary, had become the axis of their terror, an omnipresent force that no barrier, prayer, or lock could diminish. Those who stayed reported that Daniel's voice no longer merely repeated secrets. It predicted events with chilling accuracy, repeating tragedies before they occurred, echoing the sins and fears that were yet to manifest. Some swore that even the wind carried his whispers, naming hidden desires and unspoken guilt of those far beyond St. Harrow, reaching the minds of travelers who had once passed through. His influence had spread beyond the seminary walls, infiltrating the town itself and leaving every action, thought, and word under his silent judgment. The few remaining clergy, now mere shadows of their former authority, attempted to rationalize his existence. Some suggested Daniel was a divine punishment, a test of the town's collective morality. Others hinted at darker, unnatural origins, an experiment in binding human thought, sin, and fear into a single vessel. Whatever the truth, it mattered little. Daniel had transcended human comprehension. Townsfolk began speaking only in whispers, even in solitude, as if the act of thinking aloud could summon Daniel's attention. Dreams became indistinguishable from waking life, and the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. Some claimed to see figures that had long vanished walk alongside Daniel's motionless form, their voices carried in his own. By all accounts, Daniel Frost was no longer merely a boy who spoke when he was not breathing. He had become an eternal presence, the living embodiment of St. Harrow's guilt and corruption, a sentinel over secrets too terrible to acknowledge. And the town, forsaken by normalcy and consumed by its own sins, existed solely within the reach of his unending voice. By the mid-1850s, St. Harrow had become a place of stories whispered only at night. Travelers who passed near the abandoned town reported hearing a child's voice carried on the wind, repeating their innermost fears, naming sins they had thought long buried. Those who lingered too long claimed to see a pale boy standing in the windows of the Frost Seminary, chest still, lips unmoving, but voices emanating from him in a chorus of the living, the missing, and the dead. Daniel Frost had become more than a child. He was a mirror reflecting humanity's darkest truths, a repository of hidden guilt and unspoken horrors. Families who had once called the town home had either vanished entirely or fled, their minds fractured by the boy's presence. The few who remained lived in perpetual silence, whispering to each other only when absolutely necessary, fearing that any sound could call forth Daniel's judgment. Legends began to form, blending fear with reverence. Some claimed Daniel could peer into the future, exposing tragedies before they occurred. Others suggested that he could manipulate reality itself, bending the environment of St. Harrow to his will. Travelers left offerings at the edges of the town, a tacit acknowledgement of the power that neither clergy, law, nor time could diminish. Even decades later, tales of Daniel Frost persisted. Parents warned children, "Do not wander where the boy speaks, for he hears all, and no lie or sin can hide from him." Scholars who attempted to research St. Harrow found only fragments of journals, scorched pages, and whispers in archives that seemed to answer questions no one had asked. By this time, Daniel Frost had become immortal, not in flesh, but in memory, in fear, and in the echoing truths he carried. He was a living monument to the town's sins, a child who should have been silent in death, yet refused to be forgotten. In every hushed story, in every shadowed memory, Daniel's voice endures. By the 1860s, only a handful of residents remained in St. Harrow, their minds frayed by years of relentless fear. The town had become a shadow of itself, streets empty, homes decayed, and the Frost Seminary looming like a monument to the impossible. Those who remained rarely spoke aloud, their whispers carefully measured, for any sound might awaken Daniel Frost's attention. The survivors described living in a constant state of awareness, where every thought, every hidden desire, and every buried sin was at risk of being echoed back to them. Some claimed that Daniel's voice followed them even beyond the town's boundaries, slipping into dreams and private moments, reciting their confessions in tones they recognized yet could not escape. Families who had once fled found themselves inexplicably drawn back, unable to resist the pull of the boy's presence. Physical phenomena intensified, doors slammed without wind, cold drafts swept through homes, carrying whispers of lost neighbors. Shadows moved independently of their sources. Some residents reported seeing faint, pale forms of children they had once known, their voices now merging with Daniel's, repeating confessions they had tried to forget. The few who attempted to resist locking themselves in basements or fleeing into the forests often returned days later in a state of incoherence, murmuring fragments of conversations they had never had. The boundary between reality and hallucination had dissolved entirely, leaving only fear, memory, and the echo of Daniel's unbreathing voice. By now, it was clear to all who survived, St. Harrow was no longer governed by law, morality, or human reason. It existed solely under the dominion of Daniel Frost. A child who should have been silent in death had become the eternal arbiter of guilt and fear, consuming the town from within and ensuring that no secret, no sin, and no unspoken truth would ever remain hidden. By the late 1860s, St. Harrow had ceased to exist as a town of the living. Its streets were silent, save for the faintest whispers carried by the wind, whispers that seemed to echo from every abandoned home and through the walls of the Frost Seminary. Daniel Frost remained in the infirmary, motionless, pale, and unbreathing, but his voice resonated endlessly, a chorus of the living, the missing, and the dead, repeating the sins and secrets of a town long consumed by its own hidden corruption. Survivors, Shatterpropid R.O. Tyrid, spoke of Daniel not as a child but as a presence. Life and they ests UPPORT results. Dreams merged with reality. Memories became indistinguishable from hallucinations. People reported glimpses of shadowed figures moving alongside Daniel's still form, their voices layered into his own, reciting confessions, pleas, and judgments. Every thought they attempted to hide was drawn into his orbit, exposed and transformed into horror. The Frost Seminary, once a place of authority and education, had become a mausoleum of human fear, guilt, and suppressed truths. Its walls bore symbols of rituals that had failed, journals scorched and fragmented, and the lingering aura of a child who had never truly lived as others do. Scholars who ventured near decades later claimed to hear his voice, whispering in languages both known and unknowable, a testament to the magnitude of his influence. Daniel Frost had transcended mortality. He was no longer merely a boy who spoke when he was not breathing. He had become the embodiment of St. Harrow's corruption, an eternal sentinel of fear, a mirror of human sin that could never be silenced. And in every echo of wind through an empty town, in every shadow that lingers where none should, in every heartbeat of guilt unconfessed, his voice endures. Some truths cannot die, some children cannot be silenced, and Daniel Frost will never stop speaking.